Commissioner Bartlett.
Here.
Commissioner Jacobs.
Here.
Commissioner Jostes.
Here.
Commissioner Thompson.
Here.
Commissioner White.
Here.
Chair Myers.
Here. Ms. Hubble, are there any requests for continuances, withdrawals, postponements, or addition of ex-agenda items?
Chair Myers, as noted in the agenda, the Plaza de la Guerra discussion has been continued to February 21st. There's still additional staff work going on getting ready for that.
Okay, thank you. Any announcements and appeals?
You are set. I think Ms. Jacobs has agreed to attend the council hearing on February 5th regarding 518 State Street appeal. There was an appeal filed on 1236 San Andres yesterday or the day before, so we will be scheduling a hearing for that. Ms. Westbury appealed it.
Okay, thank you. At this time, we'll take comments from members of the public for any items that are not on our agenda. If there is anybody that wishes to make a comment, please step forward. Seeing no one, having no slips, I'll close the public comment period and bring us to our third item. It's an environmental hearing, application of Conceptual Motion Company, agent for DBN Carrillo LLC, 210 West Carrillo Street. Ms. Kennedy, with staff giving staff presentation.
Yes, good afternoon, Chair Myers and Commissioners. This is an environmental hearing for the Radio Square project located at 210 West Carrillo Street. Here is the project location. As you can see, it's located at the corner of De La Vina and West Carrillo. I'd like to give you a brief history of the project. An original project was reviewed by the Historic Landmarks Commission back in May of '06, and then a Planning Commission concept review of the same project the next day in May of 2006. There was a Planning Commission EIR scoping hearing last year in April of 2007. At that time, potentially significant impacts were identified in the initial study that you reviewed regarding traffic, and an EIR was required. Subsequently, the project was withdrawn by the applicant, and a new revised project was submitted. This new revised project has less commercial square footage, has the elimination of the live-work units, less parking spaces, and a new traffic analysis was submitted along with the revised project. Staff reviewed the new project and a new initial study was prepared. No potentially significant impacts related to traffic were identified with the new revised project, and all other potentially significant mitigable impacts remain the same as the previous project that you reviewed. The result is that an EIR is not required and that a mitigated negative declaration was prepared. This is the same from the previous project. The new initial study identified the following potentially significant mitigable impacts in these areas: air quality, cultural resources, hazards, noise, public services, and water environment. And like I said previously, these are all the same that were included in the original initial study. A brief overview of the revised project. The residential portion remains the same except for the live-work units, which were eliminated. There continues to be 55 residential condominium units. 21 are affordable and 34 are market rate. There are 26 units allowed per the ordinance, and 29 units are bonus density units that are being proposed. For the commercial portion, like I said previously, the elimination of the live-work commercial areas are part of the new project. There's an overall reduction of 10,874 square feet of commercial space, and there's a reduction in the number of parking spaces from 175 to 149. The next steps for the project. Today we have our environmental hearing to receive public comment on the draft MND. We will accept written comments through February 4th. The project will then return to the Historic Landmarks Commission. We have a date set for February 6th. The proposed final MND will be prepared, and we will include responses to the public comments that we received today and through February 4th. Following that, the Planning Commission hearing will be scheduled to consider the final MND and for project approval. You've received a copy of the HLC minutes from the December 12th meeting. In response to those comments, the applicant has prepared an alternate proposal, and you've received a copy of that in your packet. That consists of 31 residential units. The applicant has requested that the alternate be allowed to be presented today during this hearing. The staff is requesting that you provide comments on the alternate proposal along with the comments on the initial study. That concludes staff's presentation at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Are there any questions for staff at this time? Seeing Mr. White.
So, Ms. Kennedy, that I'm understanding that the second proposal has not gone back to HLC. Is that right?
The alternate
Right.
that's on the green sheets
Yeah.
has not been to HLC yet. And actually, staff has only reviewed it briefly. We have not had a total review by all staff members.
Okay. So then that would cycle back through. Is that what the?
Depending on how things go today, the applicant will choose to bring one of the two projects to HLC next time.
I see.
They're bringing you the alternate to get your comments, and then I think would determine which direction they would like to proceed in.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I do have a question for staff. In the mitigated negative deck, in the air quality section, there are quite a few mitigation measures proposed divided between required and recommended. Would you go into the rationale between required and recommended, why we're not using all the mitigation measures as required?
Chair Myers and Commissioner Thompson, basically because even without those mitigation measures, there is no significant impact. So when the impact is less than significant, we indicate those as recommended mitigation measures. But staff practice is to include those as conditions of approval in the project anyway.
So they would appear as in the conditions, even if they're recommended?
That's correct.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This moment, we can take the applicant's presentation. Mr. Yates.
Good afternoon, Chair Myers, fellow commissioners. I appreciate the time that you'll give us today to go through the program changes that we would like to get your input on before going back to HLC. The issues are fairly substantial, so I'd like to spend some time in going through that argument and the rationale for where we are today with regard to the project. So I appreciate your forbearance. I do have with me today Ian Brown from the client organisation, Katie O'Reilly-Rogers and Gerhard Meyer, the lead architect on the project, to answer any questions that you might have. Sorry. Before we get just an orientation, the project is located on the corner of Carrillo and De La Vina. If I can get technology to work right here. And I believe you had a site visit on Tuesday morning, is that correct?
That's correct.
The project's location relative to El Pueblo Viejo, you'll see the main El Pueblo Viejo area here, and then of course the spur out to Carrillo that encapsulates the downtown area, or the entrance to the CBD. The site itself is an ideal site for transit-oriented smart growth and sustainable development. It's approximately 1.2 acres, it's 200 feet squared, is zoned C2. It's currently a multi-tenanted retail site, and it's a perfect infill opportunity site. It's located on primary transit corridors. It's very contiguous to the local MTD or the central MTD facility and other alternative transportation. It's adjacent to the jobs in this community. It's adjacent to many amenities, as you'll see later. And it also is adjacent to commercial properties like Ralph's for food, grocery. It's adjacent to CVS Pharmacy for access to drugs and things. So residents of this site will have wonderful contiguous amenities available to them. The site is currently underutilized. The buildings are near the end of their useful life cycle. And importantly, the site is subject to a cleanup and abatement order by the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and they've been very tolerant with us in terms of the time that we're taking thus far on the project to bring it forward, knowing that a development of the project is a better mitigation of the brownfields than to try to remedy in place. The existing site is an auto-dependent land use, and it's a product of its time. And I know you're well aware of the site, so I won't go on too far from there. Where we are today, we originally submitted the PRT for this project in November 2005, and as Kathleen said, we reviewed the project with you in the HLC in May 2006. At that time, our conversation in the community was all about housing, if you'll remember, and we were working very hard to see how we could deal with variable density to bring more affordable and smaller units to the community to really respond to the needs of the workforce. After we received your input in May, we developed the application, submitted a formal DART product, and then came to you for an EIR scoping hearing in April of 2007. At which time the focused EIR on traffic was deemed necessary and we were moving forward. Well, towards the end of the year, or close to the end of the year, we still hadn't got a consultant on board, and we'd recognized the impacts that were potential from the traffic, and we felt it was important to modify the project and bring the intensity of the project down to reduce any potential for traffic impacts. So we did that, and here we are today with the revised program. We will be going back to HLC on February 6th, and your guidance today will really help us, and we hope help the HLC in the deliberations on that day. The mitigated negative deck. As I said, the ER scoping in April and the focused traffic, the traffic really looked at potentially adding 5 or more traffic trips, and we mitigated that by eliminating the live work program, reducing the commercial areas by 53%. We did retain at that time the 55-unit residential program, including the level of affordability. The project massing and scale were not affected by the changes. They do incorporate your comments from May 2006, but it really was just a question of reducing the commercial amount of commercial in the project. The result was we reduced the overall traffic trips by a net 725 relative to the existing condition on the site. And we reduced PM peak hour trips by 45, once again relative to the condition. So just a refresher, just to look at Radio Square, it's currently an auto-dependent shopping centre, a sea of asphalt. The organising principle behind this project from day one and still today is the Paseo and Plaza system that El Pueblo Viejo and the Urban Design Guidelines speak so loudly to and so much to, and we continue to retain those elements in the project, whatever decisions and choices we made. One of the advantages of reducing the commercial program is we still park per ordinance, but we reduce the overall footprint of the garage, and it gives us more permeable parking, permeable site area for water quality management, etc. So there are some advantages to this program. Graphically, you'll see here, this was originally commercial, this was originally commercial, and these units here were the live work component, and they've simply been reclaimed by the residential program. That's how you see that difference made in order to reduce that 10,800 square feet. Second level, we revised the residential unit layout. The average residential unit size is still 1,122 square feet. It's still small by standards that you're used to seeing and well below your thresholds. And that's also true of the third level and the fourth level. Some of the comments that have been responded to as the 55-unit design was developed, we reoriented the fourth floor masses towards the project interior. We reduced and varied plate heights throughout the project. Carrillo went from 17 feet to 14 feet plate heights, and the top of the roof on Carrillo was lowered to 50 feet. And you'll see we increased the size of the plaza and simplified the architecture throughout. To give you an example of the DNA of the project, the plaza system, you see the blue lines indicating the transit routes through the project, and by way of comparison, you can see La Arcada here on the top left. This is the paseo between the hotel and that leads down through the back of the State Street properties to Paseo Nuevo, and it connects into the Paseo Nuevo system, and of course this is El Paseo. So we just wanted to show you quickly and graphically how this project is responding to that central DNA of Santa Barbara, and of course we retained the generous setbacks, and particularly Radio Square. Here's a view of the elevations of that project, and you have them in your package, relative to some of other projects on major corridors in the city of Santa Barbara. And it's showing you stylistically and in terms of massing how we're responding to those. And of course, De La Vina is a different environment, and Gerhard will talk about that later. But it calls for a different architectural response. And we've used some photographs here of existing buildings to give you a sense of compatibility with the characteristics of Santa Barbara. Will Mayhem, when he was planning commissioner, put together a wonderful package that allowed us to quantify and qualitatively analyze our projects for compatibility. And he used a term called vertical envelope analysis, or EAR. And this is how the 55-unit project stacks up against that analysis. You'll see here, if you had an EAR of 0.6, and if you had a pointer that worked, it would be considered high, and 0.4 would be considered low. And the 55-unit radio square project was an EAR of 0.54. I think it's all right. The other way to look at this is in graph form, and you can see across the top the first and second floor plate heights through to the highest ridge and the EAR. And this line here represents Radio Square's EAR relative to Chapala Lofts, 102 on Anacapa Street, Chapala Street, the Bothan Building, 1123 Chapala Street, and 2323 De La Vina. So we find this a really useful tool for us as we're designing to look at how we're going in addition to the character sketches and perspectives. Another way to look at the project is, of course, average setbacks. Of course, in C2 we don't have any required setbacks, but to give you a sense of the fourth floor, it sets back off of Korea on average of 41 feet, off of De La Vina on average of 16 feet 9, the west boundary 17 feet, and the north boundary 28 feet. So it really sets back in there. You'll see data in your packages where it occupies a lot coverage of about 39%. One of the things we look for also when in your comments with a setback, so the fourth-story elements are not readily perceivable from the adjacent right-of-way, well, this is how that works. When you get a pedestrian on the other side of the right-of-way looking at the project, you can see it in section through Carrillo there and the advantage of that step back. You see the same thing happen on De La Vina, where you have a third-story parapet, basically taking the apparent mass of the fourth floor away on that street, and you'll see that condition throughout. Those are important because they go, in terms of the negative deck, to the aesthetics study and component of that. But this is really where most of the impact is. We originally had 20,200 square feet of commercial in the project, and the initial study showed we expected about a plus 22 trips AM and PM peak hour, and that's distributed through the intersections. It was going to exceed thresholds. So we pulled those back. The commercial program now calls for 9,606 square feet of commercial. We have no additional AM peak hour trips, and our PM peak hour trips are reduced by minus 45%. So there's the qualitative measurements that show us that we're able to modify the project to get it to a point where we wouldn't have cumulative impacts. So April 19, the mandatory findings of significance called for the potential for those impacts, and of course the document you have before you today has taken that potential away in the mandatory findings report. I will get that other point. So a lot of time has gone by since November 2005. And particularly over the last few months, we've been getting a lot of feedback from the community and the constituents, and we talk to them all, and we actively engage with them in the community. And since we submitted this project, we went back to HLC in December 12, and they basically hardened a stance against the project, and in effect said that the project, in their opinion, will not meet the HLC guidelines or the ordinance requirements. The project is too big and not compatible with the neighbourhood or the preservation ordinance, neighbourhood preservation ordinance, and the urban design guidelines. The massing is too large and would benefit from a reduction in the number of units. And they like us to refine and keep the Plaza and Paseo elements, that keep Radio Square on the corner, retain the below-grade parking, and retain the pedestrian experience that is such an important part of the project, and we will always do that. They indicated to us the additional affordable housing was not supportable as an offset against the larger project, and they were very, very clear about that. And of course, We're all aware that there's a large constituent group in the community who would like to see projects not exceed 3 stories or 40 feet. HLC were very clear that some of the HLC members very clearly support that stance, and although it doesn't appear in the minutes, we're adamant that that's the filter through which they would judge the project, and furthermore that they would not support the 55-unit project in its current form if it went back to them. So it places us in an interesting situation. How would we respond, and how should we respond? First of all, we think it's important to have a discussion about a more balanced approach to the project in terms of all the community values and priorities. And in doing that, retain the smart growth and sustainable elements in the project. Retain the underground parking. Look at the project as a 2- and 3-story project with the reduced plate heights and the reduced ridge heights, and continue to step back and take the other design elements into play, and to see what type of project we get back from that. The data that comes out of the project once you begin to make those changes are of course the lot area doesn't change. The building footprint gets a little larger because as we remove the 4-story, we drop down in the northwest corner of the project to be able to get the residential in there. The landscape area drops back a little. The hardscape area drops back a little. The gross building area drops back substantially by about 20,000 square feet. The gross commercial area steps back up a bit again, and I'll explain that in a moment. The residential area drops down by a total of about 17,000 square feet. Now, in order to get down into this 3-story model, we lost a lot of residential square footage, and we were able to offset that by reintroducing some of the commercial program that was back in the project, and you'll see this in plan in a moment. The result is 31 residential units using the variable density model and 15% affordable housing, and the 15% affordable housing is 4 residences. Our parking spaces come down to 122, and that's per ordinance, and our maximum building height and maximum stories are 3 and 40 respectively. I'll have Gerhard go through the plan, and then I'll come back after that and continue the comparison.
Which plan are we going to see changes from the previous plan that was
Yes,
plus the new
you're
one?
going to see proposed changes, correct.
Plus the new plan?
Yes.
Plus the 3-story plan?
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Chairman Myers, fellow commissioners, good afternoon. This is all the 31-unit program, so this is a presentation about the revised scheme. If we look at the site plan, it doesn't look much different from what we had before. We have retained the paseo system and the courtyards to the extent that they have existed many times before. I don't want to elaborate there. Let me just point out 2 things. The success of a paseo system, my opinion, depends on 2 things. Number one, how logically it connects to the existing pedestrian infrastructure. In other words, how much the paseos make sense where they go. Typically, paseos allow you to cut off a corner or to walk mid-block to some point of interest. That's how the good Santa Barbara paseos, Victoria Court, or the old paseo function. We have St. Vincent Avenue below Carrillo here that continues in this paseo north. We have a paseo paralleling the northern property lines that connects with an existing paseo not on our property. So this would be a good way of cutting through the project, and we have 2 paseos that parallel Carrillo Street and De La Vina Street. That's one feature. The second aspect is to which extent we succeed to make the paseos feel as an extension of a public realm and not just as an interior of a project that the public is allowed to be in. And we achieve this by having our podium, our parking podium, depressed below the actual walking surface. So when we walk in our paseos, we'll actually have real pavement, and we will have soil pockets that will allow us to grow real plants right out of the dirt. So it will feel not like you're on top of a parking garage where you have potted plants, but you'll feel like you're walking on real land. Now, the amount of penetration that you get by doing so will result in one thing that I would like to suggest for us all to look at this project as, is that it is a collection of individual building blocks, not as one big project. It's actually several building blocks, and we have gone to great lengths to design them so that in the end they achieve the appearance of an ensemble that has grown over time, you know, as if it had happened in the past, you know, by various architects, various different building owners. It's kind of like a virtual arrangement that way, because we know with zoning rules and parking it's not possible, but we want want this to feel authentic, like State Street, where there's various different buildings, not like one design that has a high level of articulation and still feels like one big project. Below grade, we have a reduced residential program. The lowest level of parking is the residential parking. The footprint is much reduced. You see a vast amount of unexcavated area, and we have the entire garage pushed back in the front. That gives us a great ability to have better water infiltration and to have better water quality management measures. The commercial parking level is still pushed back. You see some of the utilities buried in that dirt buffer. This is grease separators and electrical utilities. This is the way the utilities normally like to do it, so we have actually a much easier way of handling our utilities. And again, it gives us a chance to let the water run off and get it naturally absorbed in the soil. Circulation still works as always. We have an in and out of Carrillo Street, and we have an exit ramp on the northern property line. We see that exit ramp as a public benefit because it allows you to circle back into the garage without forcing anybody to go through the neighborhood. Not having this exit ramp there would force somebody to come out here, and if they want to go back into the garage, they have to go all the way into the neighborhood and come back to enter the garage. So we think this is an important feature to limit, circulation around this building block and not drag it into the adjacent neighborhood. The ground floor. We have a reduced residential program, and to compensate for that, we introduced an additional 4,560 square feet of commercial area back into the project. If you remember the project Steve talked about before, that had a much higher degree of residential areas on the ground floor. We think this is an advantage because if you imagine pedestrian walking down, they would at this point probably choose to enter the project because across the street there's the back end of Ralph's, not a very pleasant site. So you would enter this project and you would walk between two commercial street sites like in Paseo Nuevo, and basically cross through the block. So we think having the opposing commercial areas there is actually a great advantage to the streetscape. The upper level is we have reduced the number of residential units. We still have a unit mix. We don't have just large units. We still have a fair amount. I believe it's 16, 11, 8 of studios, 11 one-bedroom apartments, 8 two-bedroom apartments. We have vastly increased the setback on the northern property line towards that residential neighborhood. And we are averaging a unit size of 1,465 square feet, which is less than 85% of the zoning lot area that you're required to hold it against. So this is kind of like a measuring standard for how big the units are. I want to talk about the plazas that we included. The plazas actually have a big benefit on the livability in this project because if you notice, every one of those residential units basically has a corner. Some of them have more than one corner. Some of them actually get light from 3 sides. So living in those units will feel very different than living in a normal apartment because in a normal apartment you're just limited to that one view out that primary window front. Here you get light from all sides. You can follow the sun around your unit. You get different views. And every one of those apartments benefits from the extended view into that plaza or that courtyard. The third floor, we further have reduced, increased the setbacks from the property line. We are now completely away from Carrillo Street and completely away from De La Vina Street with the exception of that one component. So basically on those two public right-of-ways, we have 2-story elevations. And we still have a unit mix on the third floor rather than just have the large luxury units on the top floor. We still have them mixed up and we have studios, 1-bedrooms and 2-bedroom apartments. The total area of the third floor is about 3,000 square feet less than on the previous project, and the fourth floor, of course, is completely eliminated. The roof form then consists out of 3- and 2-story roofs. We notice the increased setbacks from the interior street and from the property line. If we look at the lot coverage numbers, they are, I believe, very favorable. If we look at the gross area by floor, on the third level of 39% coverage, that speaks to the amount of open space and setbacks that we have actually designed this project to. Another way to look at that is to look at the average setbacks on the third and the second floor. If you look at the third floor and compare it, for instance, to the setbacks on the existing building, which of course doesn't have a third floor, let's not compare it, but the average setback numbers are fairly generous on the third floor. And again, as Steve pointed out in C2, we don't have any setbacks in general, but we still went to a great effort to push the building away from the street and the neighboring properties. If we look at the north-south cross-section, the first thing I want to point out is that increased soil buffer. This is Carrillo Street, so we're looking, this is the adjacent neighbor up on Delavina Street. The soil buffer allows us to let the water run off and get naturally absorbed in this area. Again, we have the parking podium depressed into the ground, and our walking surface is actually about 3 feet higher. That gives us the ability to naturally plant. It also separates these buildings from each other, and I would like us to look at these buildings as a series of individual buildings, not as like one big project, as I pointed out. Each one of those individual buildings is measured from its relative elevation, and it never crosses 40 feet height. This line is the 60 feet envelope that is still valid according to current zoning. Each one building stacks up roughly as a 14-foot commercial area, 11 to 12 residential, 8 to 9-foot plate, and then a vault area to 39.5-foot ridge. And again, with that reduced building height, the proportions of the courtyard spaces is very generous, and you can just imagine the ample sunlight and ample exposure that people in those courtyards will get. This is an east-west section. Similar story as before. I just wanted to point out to relate this to the domed form on the CVS building. This is a height that the entire project then respects all the way across. Again, two-story parking. The lowest level, the residential program, allows us a smaller footprint, so there's less excavation on the site. Carrillo Street elevation. Carrillo Street is the entrance to the central business district, and emotionally we always wanted to relate this building not to the immediate context on Carrillo Street, which is like a Jiffy Lube across the corner, that's the parking lot of a strip mall, but emotionally we want this building to belong to the stretch of Carrillo Street between Chapala and Anacapa Street. That's where it's a grand boulevard as a worthy entrance to the central business district. Even with the reduced height of 2 stories, this building still aspires to belong to that language. And on those blocks, there are 2-story buildings. It's not just a function of height, whether you have that statue to give it the entrance to the central business district. This diagram shows you what happened by eliminating the top floor. This was the previous condition, and lowering the building by an entire story gives you that much more exposure to the sky. Delavina Street was always a completely different street. We have, of course, Radio Square on the corner here. Delavina Street is a neighborhood collector street, so we wanted to treat it differently all the time. Again, it kind of like aspires not to its immediate context, but to the context a little bit further up and down the block where it actually is a residential street. So this series of building is designed to look as if it had been happening over time by individual owners. So one owner would have built this building, the next owner would have built this building, and so forth. How this looks in diagram, should a person actually choose to be here, because this is right in front of the Ralph's loading dock, but if somebody walks along on that side of the street, then the reduced height again allows a better exposure to the sky. And I just wanted to point out the reduced building form next to the Victorian house on the northern property line. The size of this volume is almost identical to the size of the volume of the house. So we're basically having an equal match there now, whereas previously we had a bigger building mass there. This is the elevation of the northern property line. Again, we have pushed the building back. It is lower by an entire story, and we have articulated the wall on that property line. Previously, we've always heard that the neighboring property really doesn't want to connect here, so we have a wall closing it all off right now, and the wall is relatively low, in some portions even lower than the current wall is of the current strip mall. And this is the elevation to the western property line. This is not going to be seen by too many people, because unless somebody chooses to walk on that lost paseo, once we connect it, perhaps people will walk along that. This is on the property line next to the drugstore. But still, we are proceeding with articulating the building as if they had been built over time as individual structures. And we have a fair amount of articulation just by implying that natural virtual building language over the elevation. And I believe this is the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay,
Mr.
I
Yates.
appreciate the time that you're allowing us. Thank you. So we'll quickly just do some comparisons. First of all, once again, the Plazas and Plazas that are such a defining element of this community retained in the project with the proposed changes. Here's that same view again with those adjacent buildings, looking at it with the two-story project versus the submitted application. And of course, De La Vina begins to respond the same way. You're now becoming familiar with those elevations. Here's that EAR analysis again. You'll see now the EAR on the project is now down at 0.44, which is and 0.41, which is in the very low range of that statistical analysis of the project. And of course, you could see the same thing occur in the graph form. Oops. On the graph form. And you'll see these EARs right out here on these other projects that are beautiful buildings, make no mistake about it. And here's the relationship of radio squared to those projects from that form of analysis. Just quickly, a couple of qualitative images. These are the interior plazas, and just wanting to show you how we've drawn inspiration from the existing fabric of Santa Barbara. And you'll see that through different angles and the amount of pedestrian open space that is in the project. Compatibility with the neighbors and being sensitive to the neighbors. This is on Korea Street, the adjacent building. This is the building on our property now that would be demolished, and this is a much, I think, more sensitive and appropriate response to that building than it exists today. As Gerhard mentioned, now a really nice, wonderful relationship. That's the eave of the adjacent building there in the photograph, and that's our property line there. So I think we've been very successful in having a more balanced approach and response to our neighbors with this version of the project. Just quickly, comparatively, you can see it in elevation form. The project as submitted and the project as with the proposed changes, and I'll just run through each of the sections there. And you can see a demonstrable change to the mass and scale of the project as a result. We also can see that we look at the 3- and 4-story design from Korea, and we see the change to the 2- and 3-story design. We look at the same thing from De La Vina looking back from 3.4 to 2.3, and then this is powerful when you see this from De La Vina looking down, the relationship of the projects. And then more immediately on the corner, the 4.3 project, oops, and the 3.2 project. And you'll notice on the 3.2 project now our relative heights compared to Ralph's right here across that Korea intersection. So they're the aesthetic massing qualities that we're looking at in an attempt to be more balanced in our response to the community. You saw this chart earlier. It does affect the program. We're a 31-unit project versus a 55-unit project. There's some important things to talk about here, though. Oh, quickly before I go there, I just wanted to make sure on the inclusionary housing plan you were aware. We still retain the small unit approach. So the studios, 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms. So we've got 10 market rate studios, 10 market rate 1 bedrooms, 7 market rate 2 bedrooms, and then the 4 affordable product that reflects that same mix. So we didn't revert back to the fat, oversized townhomes. Very important, because today's about environmental issues. We went ahead and did a traffic analysis on this proposed changes to reassure you that if you were if you felt that this was the more balanced and appropriate response to the community, that we would be in the condition that's supported by the negative deck, where we have no additional traffic trips and we're below any cumulative thresholds. So just an important thing. I always like to tell you, it reminds you, the project doesn't require any design modifications other than that for the affordable housing. It really does respond to all your policies and ordinance. And I've spent a lot of sleepless nights thinking about this project. In 2005, when we first began looking at this, the conversation, as I said, was all about housing, and we really came forward with what we thought was an innovative approach to reducing unit size and bringing more affordability projects. Well, times change. But does that mean we have to change our principles? And when we look at how we respond to the community in a balanced way, what principles are intact? And the project still meets many standards that are very, very important to us. It has a mix of land use. It takes advantage of compact building design. It has a range of housing types. It has that pedestrian realm and the walkable neighborhoods, and it certainly has a strong sense of place that's characteristic of Santa Barbara. Is it still a sustainable project? It has all of those elements: sustainability, water efficiency, energy and atmosphere conservation, use of material and resources, and other design processes that will mean this will be, in our mind, a building that will retain LEED, or have the potential to be LEED certified, even if we don't get the typeface correct down the bottom there. Of course, back to the original premise, the site selection is so important in terms of where to put housing in this community. It has amenities, it's close to jobs, it's close to alternative transportation. Those things don't go away. So we have a cleanup of a brownfield site. We're providing housing and amenities, and we're adding to the pedestrian realm in a really powerful way. And of course, that powerful way is certainly responding to the urban design principles that are a part of sustainable Santa Barbara. I missed this slide, and I just wanted to finish on this before we open up to comment. Our first responsibility as we think about how to respond to the environment that we're faced with is to the environment, bringing forward projects that are smart growth, that respond to global warming issues, respond to community wellness issues, and respond to the need to provide housing. That's our first responsibility. Both projects do that. Our second responsibility is to respond to our community. And at the moment, the community is sending us mixed messages and sometimes polemic messages about how they would want us to move forward. The way we sleep at night is to step back and take the most balanced approach to those conflicting values and priorities. And that's what we're sincerely trying to do today, and it's what we're hoping to get back and feedback from you as it relates to that. And of course, we all want to build a project that not only meets our technical criteria, but it's also one that the entire community is going to be happy that's built. I don't want my friends and colleagues and people who I might disagree with but nevertheless respect driving by this building for the next 50 years saying, "Steve, damn him." So there's a few really important things at play here that I want you to think about as you go through this. Of course, there's less affordable housing, and that it took us weeks and weeks and weeks of sleepless nights to work this out. And I don't take these responsibilities lightly. But it's important that I remember this is still an affordable project. This city has met and formed policy around our inclusion housing ordinance saying don't exceed the 15%. And there's reasons that we did that. And perhaps this is a chance for us to look at this and look at the bundle and make sure we've got a more balanced approach to those priorities. One of the things that I'm worried about is the temptation that I've had, that I'm sure you'll have, to split the difference. Right? If we begin now, and I've really worked hard to bring you two alternatives and projects that really respond. If we attempt to split the difference and begin to unbalance these values that we've weighed so carefully, we end up with the potential for the worst possible outcome. And every smart guide principle, every APA conference you'll go to, every AIA conference you'll go to, they'll tell you one of the barriers to providing housing is the process. And I don't want to get into a polemic discussion with this community that says we don't understand sensitively what they're trying to achieve. So I really encourage you, as you're as you're feeling that impulse to split the difference, to really think about that. If you take on board our suggestions today, we'll still have a project that's an exemplary smart growth project, and it'll be one that's consistent with this city of Santa Barbara. It won't have as much housing as I'd like to have, but this town's not just about what I want, it's about what a lot of other people want as well. So I look forward to your comments and appreciate them in advance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yates. Are there any comments or questions for the, let me rephrase that, are there any questions for the applicant? No questions? Mr. White?
Mr. Yates or Mr. Gerhardt, could you give us a little bit of information on the sidewalks, how those are going to change their widths and how that's going to be proposed?
Chair Myers, Commissioner White. We have voluntarily set back 4 feet along Carrillo Street to allow for us to meet the circulation standards of a 12-foot pedestrian way there. So we have 8 feet of sidewalk and a 4-foot parkway on Carrillo. On De La Vina, we are at the property line and observing the existing condition. Ultimately, our project will come forward and will recommend alternative materials to the city standard, and we will work with Public Works to look at what the materiality might be.
And what is that on De La Vina? When you say existing condition, what is the width of the sidewalk there?
I believe it is, I'm looking, 10 feet.
12 on 10.
That's correct.
And no parkway on De La Vina?
Correct.
When we're at that subject, this little pedestrian access.
This one
there
here?
we go. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the walkway there. Are there any improvements planned in that area? It's narrow on the adjoining property. Will you be? It looks like you're right up to your lot line there.
That is correct. We could create the opportunity for that future connection. It would be up to that landlord or that owner to respond to our design in our mind.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Thompson?
I have a question for staff and maybe the applicant, but the issue of traffic analysis, when we are looking at this alternate proposal with the 50% increase in commercial, Mr. Yates alluded to a traffic analysis, but that doesn't appear in the negative deck that we have. Is it done, or will it have to be done, and how does that impact going through this environmental process here on the mitigated negative deck?
Chair Myers and Commissioner Thompson, what we foresee happening at this point, we will need to take a look at the traffic analysis and decide whether it's still, whether the revised project, the 3-story project, still works. But we believe, I think Mr. Foley can speak a little bit more to the actual analysis. What we intend to do is, assuming the comments today lead the applicant toward the 3-story project, then we will continue to work with the existing negative declaration, but what we'll do is adopt it with an addendum that recognizes the changed project description when the project comes back for consideration.
Ms. Jacobs?
Thank you, Chair Myers. My question is not about the project specifically, but about the environmental document, and in particular on the recreation discussion within the document. Perhaps this is just boilerplate that we reuse, or perhaps there's room for changing the language in here a bit. It's page 22, and there's a lovely description of the regional parks in Santa Barbara and the acreage of the parks and the aquatic facilities and tennis courts and so on. However, in a recent presentation, our parks director let us know that the city's master plan for parks has not been updated, is long overdue for an update, and also that the National Recreation and Park Association standards have not been adopted by our city. And so when we get to this part of the environmental document, we can proclaim that we have enough parkland, but in our local presentation by our parks director, the west side is one of those areas that does not have or is underserved in neighborhood parks. And we don't mention it here, and it may not be that this project has a significant enough impact on recreational needs, but I would like to see our needs assessment, our actual local needs assessment for neighborhood parks included in our environmental documents. There were at least 3 parts of the city that were underserved for neighborhood parks, and this was one of them, and I didn't really see it reflected in the document. Thank you.
Mr. Bartlett?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is actually for staff. Why is it that we couldn't have had the discussion for the regional housing needs allocation ahead of this project because they seem so tied. To review this project and then afterwards we're going to find a whole different set of conditions and wonder why we just did what we just did. So this whole thing seems backwards to me, and I just wanted to point that out. Secondly, I wanted to ask, on traffic, it always seems to be site-specific, but with the smaller scheme, I'm assuming we're going to have no discussion about the impact of 17 more families commuting on the freeway, because that's not part of the smaller project, or, I mean, it only deals with what's on site? Because I think the smaller scheme is probably going to have other traffic impacts that won't be addressed necessarily in the traffic report.
I'm not quite sure I understand where you're trying to go. I mean, are you saying that the reduction in the number of the units means that we're sending those unbuilt units someplace else?
No, the workers that would have lived in those units will be most likely living out of town if there's not units for them to live in here.
Well, there is still a net decrease in commercial square footage for the entire site.
Right.
So from that standpoint...
Right, but I do think that there's probably a commuting implication of having fewer units on site, and I somehow doubt that that's going to be addressed in the traffic analysis.
Well, and I'm not sure if we know how we could address it. And that really is something that has to be handled on a program level, not on a project level.
Okay. Well, again, that goes back to the regional housing needs allocation and the implications of what it does on traffic, so I wish we could have had that discussion first. Thank you.
Mr. Justice?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a question of clarification for Ms. Hubble. So in doing this addendum approach, you're still coming back to us when we actually consider the merits of the project as proposed and this alternative project with a document that can serve both a 4-story project and a 40-foot project.
I think I'd like to clarify that. I think what is going to come back to you is going to be whichever project it seems like the applicant chooses is most likely to get approved. And if it's the smaller project, then we will have the mitigated negative declaration and an addendum to it that details how the impacts change, which is pretty modest overall. Certainly, we concluded on the aesthetics that the 4-story project is less than significant, but certainly adverse. I think the 3-story project is still adverse, but not as adverse, because you look at it existing and proposed. But everything else is pretty much very similar, except the traffic changes a little bit. So we would cover that in an addendum. If out of the discussion today and the discussion with the Historic Landmarks Commission coming up in February of the alternative design, the applicant moves forward with a smaller design, or they come back with the same design that they submitted, then we'll just we'll recommend adoption of the negative declaration in front of you. Staff does have concerns that although we don't believe it's a significant visual impact from an environmental standpoint, we do believe that there are concerns from a policy standpoint for the 4th-story project. So that we would deal with in the staff report if they decide to move forward with the 4-story project.
Ms. Larson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I noticed that in the environmental document, just to dovetail on Ms. Jacobs' comment, that listed were interior recreational spaces, Louise Lowry Davis Center, Westside Community Center, where we're creating neighborhoods and we're lacking open space with ground for people to use. And I just didn't think that really reflected a true portrayal of opportunity for a neighborhood to be outdoors. So that was along those lines. I had a similar question, but it was that's my question. The other question I have is I would like to have on the Carrillo on the Carrillo Street experience, I would like to have you describe, the applicant describe one more time, the way that the parking exits on Carrillo or enters from Carrillo. You don't even have to, you can say exit or.
Exit and enter.
Thank you. Exit and enter both. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Flip up here. I'll close questions and open up public comment. We were very liberal with the applicant in their presentation, so I'll allow some extra time for public comment. I'd appreciate you still trying to be concise. First, we have Sheila Lodge, followed by Nancy Capone.
Good afternoon, Chair Myers and Planning Commissioners. I'm Sheila Lodge, Chair of the Citizens Planning Association South County Land Use Committee, which met this week to consider Radio Square mixed-use development, and the committee adopted the following motion. Now, of course, it's based on what was originally presented. One, that a full EIR be required for this project. Two, that cultural and historic resources be considered within that EIR. Three, that the method staff uses to determine project eligibility for a partial or mitigated negative declaration be publicly reviewed with the Commission so the larger community can understand their intent and process. Four, that the Commission review with staff whether the city's master environmental assessment is still an accurate and contemporary measure under CEQA of cumulative impacts the downtown and waterfront area now face. Five, that the Commission, in connection with Radio Square, publicly review how the staff determines that large new projects meet the neighborhood compatibility standard in the city charter as regarding size, bulk, scale, and neighborhood compatibility. And that the Commission discuss with staff whether the Measure E trigger definition and standards for large mixed-use projects already along congested, high-traffic volume corridors still work as intended. Radio Square and other large downtown area projects now moving forward must be held to the highest environmental review and community planning standards. We trust that the Planning Commission agrees and will take the appropriate actions. May I also read the statement from Ms. Kovacs, who's ill?
Sure, by all means.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing Sheila Lodge to read a personal statement for me as I'm out ill today. It's from Naomi Kovacs, who's the Executive Director of Citizens Planning Association. It was not until about 11 a.m. today that I heard that this morning the applicants from Radio Square Project submitted a revised project proposal. Immediately, three serious concerns came to my mind. The first one has been answered. It was about whether it was going back to HLC, and apparently it is on February 6th. Second, due to the last-minute timing of this change, the public has not really received sufficient notice and information regarding the project changes to weigh in on this matter, and I'm concerned that this constitutes a violation of noticing requirements. Third, a new or at least sufficiently revised initial study will need to be submitted for both your review and the public's review. This hearing needs to be postponed or continued until a new initial study and accompanying negative declaration, if deemed appropriate by the initial study, are submitted and publicly noticed with sufficient time for meaningful review by both the Planning Commission and the public. Thank you.
Ms. Lodge, Mr. White has a question for you.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Lodge, your committee alluded to historic resources. Do you have specific
I was concerned
ideas there?
about the proximity of at least one landmark building and an immediate proximity, the Victorian structures in the neighborhood.
So it's the proximity to historic structures that should be taken into account.
Exactly.
Great. Thank you. And
I just want to throw in one personal comment. I understand from I know there's a concern about the loss of affordable units that former Planning Commissioner Bill Mahan, an architect, has said that you can build 4 stories within 40 feet, if it's all, especially as some of the buildings here are all residential. It may not be necessary to lose so many of the affordable units. Thank you.
Thank you. Nancy Capone, followed by Lincoln Gray.
Hello, I'm Nancy Capone, and thank you all for allowing the public to speak. I'm a homeowner in the immediate vicinity of the proposed Radio Square project, and we do appreciate the fact that the project has been scaled down from what was initially proposed, and that will begin to address some of the neighborhood concerns that we have, which would include the overall density, the extreme traffic that we face already on De La Vina Street and Carrillo. It's become so dangerous that people are afraid to ride their bikes anymore, let alone walk. It's because of the car impact, and just even adding a few more car trips is going to make our neighborhood that much more dangerous. I also would like to speak to the need for a large sidewalk area along both Carrillo and De La Vina, because it is used as a corridor for everything from baby carriages and wheelchairs and, bicycles. Since it's too dangerous to ride the bikes, of course, on the streets there, they do end up on the sidewalks as well, and we need to allow sufficient and very wide spaces to accommodate the wheeled and pedestrian traffic that already is occurring there. And we appreciate your consideration of these concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. Lincoln Gray, followed by Violet Gray.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee here. I live right next door to this project at 1021 De La Vina Street. I am one of the trustees of the trust that owns the property. I think that the new proposal is a great improvement over the previous one, which was grotesque in my opinion. I do think we should ask for a full environmental impact report on this. Also, as demolition proceeds on the current buildings there, I think we really need to look very carefully at the soil that's being taken out of there. It's very badly polluted from the previous dry cleaning businesses there. I remember smelling that as a child. I learned to ride a bicycle in that little driveway next door. I live in the old Victorian, which has been restored. We've spent great amounts of money and effort to keep it up. It's one of the older frame houses in Santa Barbara. It was built in 1880. It's solid redwood. My great-grandmother died in it. My grandmother died in it. My grandfather died in it. My youngest daughter was born in it, so it means a great deal to us. We're not changing it. We're going to be there. I would implore you to follow all the ordinance, grant no exceptions. I think we need to follow the regulations and ordinances to the T and really look at all this. But back to my previous point, when demolition is begun and they start digging out, and I understand they're going to remove a lot of the contaminated soil, I think that it ought to be revisited and looked at very carefully to ensure that we actually are getting that mess cleaned up. And it's a large mess. The aquifer runs down towards the ocean there, and it spreads quite a distance, I believe. That's really all I have to say at this point. As I say, the new proposal is better than the previous one.
Thank you.
I do say that we must follow the ordinance and really look at this very carefully from an environmental standpoint. The traffic on De La Vina and Carrillo is extreme, and this is only going to increase it. All inner cities have a lot of traffic problems. I understand that. I don't think enough credence has been given to the loading bay of Ralph's right across the street. The continual large truck traffic there commonly, and I watch it every day, day in and day out.
We're just thinking about this project.
Block all 4 lanes. The trucks come all the way down to the stop sign at Carrillo, block all 4 lanes, and then have to zigzag to maneuver up into the dock. And they're supposed to come in the early morning hours, but they don't. When Ralph's needs something or their delivery is delayed, the trucks come. Even on a rainy day like this morning,
Mr. Gray, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up, okay?
Okay.
I think you've made your point about this particular project.
Yes.
And I appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you.
Violet Gray, followed by Gil Berry.
Good afternoon. Well, I've been saved from saying a number of things I was going to say because, thank you, Mrs. Lodge, I really feel that this is not an appropriate form of review. I have not been able to look at any of the information about the new alternative proposed development, so I just don't feel like this is fair to us. As I am Violet Gray, I'm here representing both my mother, Eileen Gray, and the Gray Family Trust, who co-own the property at 1021 De La Vina Street. I attended the Historic Landmarks Committee meeting. They hated this project. The chair said, I don't want to ever see this project back here again. So it's really not a matter of revise this or change it or bring the scale down. It was this project does not work for this corner. My brother covered very nicely the family matters. This is an old family home. We're going to stay there, and we're never going to let it go. But from a business perspective, the 3 cottages on our property, actually, their front doors face this development. We're going to have all of our tenants move out the minute development begins. And it's very possible that this development will do real material damage to our property as well as financial damage in terms of income. And we feel that the developer should be required to post a bond to protect us and guarantee our potential damages. I think that's pretty much all I have to say. I really hope that you'll require that we have a full EIR here. Thank you.
Thank you. Gil Berry, followed by Catherine McCammon.
I'd like to hand out a letter to each of you. Would you mind passing it? My name is Gil Berry. I'm a local architect and a member of Allied Neighborhoods Association, but I'm speaking as an individual now. There's a huge difference between the bigger 4-story project and the new 3-story project. The original 4-story project is the worst project to ever be submitted, but I feel that this revised 3-story project is the best project ever to be submitted to the city. To me, it's like ugly versus beauty. It's like night and day. I really commend the architect for his balanced design in the revised project that takes into account the desire of our community to maintain human scale and our small town character. And I would support this new 3-story, 40-foot project, but I would appeal to council any larger project. I guarantee you, any larger, it's going to get appealed. It's going to get fought by the community. So I love the new smaller project, but anything bigger is just going to be opposed. There are numerous errors and omissions in the environmental document as outlined in my letter. I ask you to please read it. I don't have time to go through it all. But one thing is that the intersection air pollution needs to be measured because there's a hot spot there that the residents are going to be subjected to an adverse significant impact to have to breathe a high level of air pollution. The groundwater has intermittent 17 feet deep below grade. The 20-foot deep parking structure, therefore, will intermittently set 3 feet in the groundwater. The walls are waterproof, but not the floor. The floor will leak, and the water would get 3 foot deep in the lower level. And this would be an adverse significant impact to the residents. Having 20-foot deep structure into intermittent 17 feet groundwater will cause liquefaction during an earthquake. The building would actually fail during an earthquake due to liquefaction. There's no truck in Santa Barbara that tests liquefaction. It has to be brought in from out of town. The existing soil report did not test for liquefaction. That has to be done. It could find a significant adverse impact. Visually, the gross floor area ratio of the original project was 2.0. Most all projects in the city are less than 1. The Burkus project that was denied because it was out of the scale of the city or the community due to the mass bulk and scale had a floor area ratio of 1. And there's like maybe 0.1% of any building in Santa Barbara that's over like 1. And like 99% of the commercial buildings, mixed-use buildings, and multi-residential buildings have a floor area ratio under 1. So the fact that the original one was 2 showed it's double what the top 1% of the bulkiest buildings. It's just totally out of character for our community. And then under noise, the noise on the site is 70. The allowed threshold 60. Therefore, in the sound report, it says the windows cannot be opened. That's an adverse significant effect to the residents that they can't open their windows. The building code requires that units have ventilation. How can you get ventilation in when it has noise and air pollution? The people are subjected to their health from noise and air pollution. The exterior patios have to have, some of them, 6-foot sound walls. The architect needs to draw some of these 6-foot sound walls on his elevation so that the Landmark Commission can see what the effect is of these 6-foot sound walls. And studies have shown that these outdoor areas that have 70 decibels don't work. The neighbors, the occupants don't use them. It goes against the principles of our codes that require these outdoor living areas. If they're subjected to 70 decibels and people don't use them, if they use them, it's harmful to their health. So there are just numerous things that are wrong with the environmental document. Thank you.
Mr. Berry, your organization obviously put a lot of effort into this. I'm curious if maybe you could supply us with references on the hot pocket issue and the noises and maybe some of the radiuses that you came up with.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Catherine McCammon, followed by Kellum DeForest.
Good afternoon. I'm Catherine McCammon, and I'm here for the League of Women Voters. It does pose some difficulty for us because we're in the middle of working on the negative declaration, and then suddenly there's a new proposal. One process issue we were concerned about is that the draft initial study that's before you today was dated January 14th. Yet the mitigated negative declaration was dated January 9th. Why is this significant? The 9th, it says a mitigated declaration is okay. The document dated the 14th says the project needs an EIR. We agree with...
Chair Myers, if I could go ahead and respond to that. There was an error on that page 28. It should have said MND. So January... Either one, it's a negative declaration.
So they're both supposed to be...
Yes.
Thank you. That clarifies that. We agree with Citizens Planning Association that a full EIR should be required on this project. We think the project is trying to put way too much development on the lot, and it requires a modification. We think the bulk and scale is too big. We think the project is not compatible with the neighborhood and does not meet the EPB guidelines. We support many of the concerns raised at the HLC. Compatibility should be based on compatibility of the surrounding buildings, not just on the fact that there are a couple of taller buildings on Carrillo Street. Need to also look at the smaller residential buildings on De La Vina, and the city needs to work on some kind of buffer or transition area between the low buildings and the idea of suddenly going up 4 stories. The project description. As to the affordability of the units, nothing talks about the level of affordability. Are the 21 proposed units affordable for workforce housing, or are they more affordable than that? Are the market units smaller and thus more affordable? We have no idea of the differentiation of price. How will the affordable units be handled? Will there be a lottery under the Housing Authority or what? Visual resources. We're very concerned about the blockage of the views, and we note that in the initial study there's no mention of the potential significant impacts of views. If you look at what's on the web for this project and the staff report, the photo showing the San Ynez Mountains is totally inadequate. Then what about the views of the Mesa? If you're on De La Vina Street driving along there, you do see the Mesa. We had a concern about landscaping that I think is maybe addressed in the potential new proposal, and that is will everything have to be in pots, or will there be actual plantings in the ground? Still a little fuzzy as to whether there's landscaping on both Carrillo and De La Vina. Discussed before, we're concerned with the consistency and inconsistency of El Pueblo Viejo. Air quality. The section isn't adequate in the initial study. At one point it talks about they use a standard of 25 tons of pollutants averaged over a 12-month period. But how do we know that there wouldn't be specific months when the pollution would be greater and therefore hazardous to people's health? Concerned particularly during the grading period. The number of trucks going in and out. Have no idea how many trucks it will take. There's a discussion of impacts on sensitive receptors, but it's not fully developed. Then we'd like more detail on the potential hazards. When is the groundwater monitoring to be implemented, and why is this only on a semi-annual basis? Where are the off-site wells? Noise. We're concerned about the noise levels for both the people living in the units and the surrounding area. There's talk of mitigation of the HVAC unit on the Save-On building. Well, an action by a third party isn't really a mitigation, and you can't really rely on it unless it's done before project approval. Then you heard Mr. Berry talk about the idea of the interior noise levels. This windows closed requirement. A mitigation is mechanical vents. Will you also need air conditioning? How does this all work? And how does this fit with our impact on our concern about sustainability goals? Then, as we have said before, notice to adjacent neighbors when there's going to be extreme construction noise is, it's good that you're giving them notice, but I guess that means if they're sensitive receptors, they have to pack up and leave. Population and housing. The proposed residential units are intended to meet existing demand for ownership housing units within the community and would not induce growth. That's what it says. But what's the basis for the assumption? Because when you look at further on in the document, under the discussion of schools, it says some portion of new employees may in-migrate. So it's kind of interesting that the commercial part anticipates new people coming in, and yet the residential is supposed to be for existing people, but yet the problem is made worse because there'll be new people coming to the commercial. I think Commissioner Jacobs brought up the part about the parks, and we too are concerned about the west side being underserved. And also, Commissioner Larson mentioned the stuff was indoor space. Well, they do mention a park. It's Spencer Adams Park. But we think it ought to have a parenthesis that this is the lawn bowling part. This is not really where children can go and play. Transportation, this is one of the most congested areas of the city. And there is this whole need to look at the cumulative traffic, but also to look at the traffic. Over and over again, we've had this discussion of if something isn't up to its full potential, there are these ghost trips. And so that all needs to be talked about more. Then another issue that we're concerned about for the community as a whole is every time there's a new project, there's a tremendous amount of interruption of existing roadways during construction. We would like to have the city pay more attention to that and include that in an environmental impact report. As to the revised project, we're very intrigued with this. We like the idea of 40 feet in the El Pueblo Viejo, We like the idea of greater setbacks, the mix of units, the 3 stories. Also, we would like to know more because we think the water runoff management sounds much better, and it sounds more sustainable and environmentally sound. We like the idea of the planting pockets, and as I said before, this could be a way of creating the buffer between the existing neighborhood and the new project. Struck that there will be more today that we heard about more exposure to the sky. I think this is something that is part of Santa Barbara's quality of life, along with views and protecting our historic resources. So we'd like an EIR on the 4-story project if that's going forward. And we need to know more and probably have some kind of initial study on the new proposal. And we're looking forward to that because we think it holds some promise of at least somewhat reducing the impacts of the 4-story project. Thank you.
Thank you. Our last speaker will be Kellum DeForest. If anyone else wishes to speak, please fill out one of these and bring it on up.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Kellum DeForest. The applicant has referred to mixed messages. So, as you all know, the big message from the citizens of Santa Barbara is that the height and bulk of new buildings must be reduced. A 35 limit in Paseo Nuevo and a 40-foot limit in commercial zoned areas is part of a proposed charter amendment now being circulated. This project is in the Pueblo Viejo district with proposed 35-foot limits. Affordable housing is an admirable goal. The project now greatly lessens those affordable units. I would like to know who buys the market rate condos. Considering the current market, the purchase of such condos may be just out-of-towners looking for a once-in-a-while getaway. CEQA considerations demand a environmental impact report. Due to this project's location in this historic section of town and the historic designated structures, these structures of merit in the area. Another question is, what happened to the Park Plaza planned for the corner of Chapala and Carrillo that was on one set of plans I saw? As to the 2-story deep parking area, where does the dirt go? As with the proposed St. Francis Cottage Hospital project, the pollution from the particulates from this excavation need to be considered. Thank you very much.
Thank you. With that, I'll close public comment. Bring it back to the Commission. Mr. Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question for Ms. Hubble. And I know when we have a project that undergoes a substantial revision, when you have an EIR, it gets the review process, public review process goes a certain way. This is clearly the case where an applicant has reduced the project scale in response to both the environmental factors and community reading of the tea leaves, if you will. How has the city dealt with these types of downsizings in terms of public review?
Chair,
in the ND process.
Right. Chair Myers and Commissioner Justice, I think probably I want us to talk about it in both types of process. When we have an EIR, we often get alternative analysis as part of the EIR process, and one of those alternatives is always designated as the environmentally superior alternative, in addition to the no project alternative. So the EIR process clearly has the alternatives approach built into it, and we can just use the EIR as written in many cases to consider the less impacting project. In the case of a mitigated negative declaration, normally what happens with something like this is that we get the negative declaration, we get to a project approval. The project may even be approved, and then they come back and say, well, we want to do something a little smaller based on what, things that have come up. And what we do is an addendum. It doesn't really change the public process for what we're doing. We talked about this among staff and with the applicant, because we had, the applicant became very clear based on what we had originally seen for the project and the HLC's recent comments that the project as proposed before you and as submitted was going to be tough to approve. And staff had expressed its concerns about the project as proposed and whether staff could support the project as proposed. So this is the applicant's response, is to come back with this alternative now. And it does confuse everybody a little bit, I have to admit. But always up to the point that the project is approved, and actually even after project approval, the applicant can always come back and say, well, or if the project was denied and the applicant said, well, what if I redesign? And when you're reducing a project size and scale, it's very seldom that impacts actually increase as a result of the reduction. I can't think of anything off the top of my head where it would increase. So it's covered within the certified or adopted mitigated negative declaration. Sometimes we will do an addendum to that MND just to document the changes and how the impact levels are reduced as a result. Some of the comments that were raised today by the public need to be responded to whichever project we move forward with. They've raised some very good comments that we need to respond to. But in any case, bringing an alternative project, the applicant could have, after this hearing, decided, well, the comments I heard on the project and on the environmental review at this hearing indicate that I should go back and redesign my project. So when I come back before the commission to adopt the MMD, I'm going to come back with that revised project anyway. The applicant had a little more foresight than usual, and said,
Than the applicant's his foresight or other people's foresight?
All of the above. And said, let's at least bring up this alternative as a concept for the PC to look at while we're holding the environmental hearing on the larger project, so that the applicant can get a sense which way he should proceed from here. So that was a decision that the staff agreed to, since it was pretty clear that the project that was proposed did not have a lot of community support.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Vincent.
if I may also add to Jan's response to Commissioner Jostes, not only does the city have its own process in the way it deals with these project revisions, but CEQA has its own way of addressing these as well. Some of the members of the public have called for either a recirculation and in some cases an EIR. I'd like to address both subjects. The process for an EIR comes out of the initial study process and requires the finding of a potentially significant, unmitigable adverse impact. It's not that we want one, you have to find the significant impact, and you have to find that it's not subject to a feasible mitigation. As far as a recirculation of the MND, Guideline 15073.5 regards this recirculation of a negative declaration prior to adoption, and says that recirculation is not required under the following circumstances, one of which I think is applicable in this particular situation. However, I will reserve that judgment in the sense that staff hasn't a chance to review the new proposal. If new project revisions are added in response to written or verbal comments on a project's effects, which are identified in the proposed negative declaration and which do not or are not new avoidable significant effects, recirculation of the MND is not required. So to address calls for a recirculation, staff still has to look at the new proposal and see if it presents any new significant impacts, which still could be mitigated, not requiring an EIR, but might require a recirculation of the MND. The proposal that I've seen so far, and I think staff will review it, has reduced effects that already have been identified as potentially significant but mitigable: traffic, aesthetics, in light and air, and so forth. So it's very likely that a recirculation would not be required under that guideline section.
Thank you, Mr. Vincent. Okay, further comments from the Commission? Yes. Mr. White, would you like to start?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, first of all, I want to appreciate the enormous amount of work that Mr. Yates' team has put into this project. It is clearly a very professional and acute offering that you're bringing forward today. So I thank you for that. To me, the comments that we've heard about scale, I think you've gotten those at the concept review here before. That, from me anyway, it is clearly the 40-foot version or thereabouts is the shell, is the volume that can work for me as a project. I guess here's a question: does the Lavina sidewalk? This would be to Steve Foley. Does the Lavina sidewalk, as proposed, is that meeting our city's guidelines for that sidewalk?
Commissioner White, yes, the width meets the requirements on the De La Vina side and also on the Carrillo side.
Right. Well, thank you. If I were to looking at this shell, I mean, the obvious, and I can feel the vibrations from my far right about the loss of the affordable housing, which is clearly the sad component of the change. I look at this volume or its cousin, and also I appreciate you're bringing forward a project, and it's our job to look at a project. We can give you feedback on it, but going half and half, I mean, all the sort of rug trading or bartering is some of that goes on, and that's up to you as a developer, is how you handle the information that you get. And you've obviously come forward with another option, having gotten such strong feedback from HLC in the past. So it isn't our job to come up with a redesign, but to feedback on the designs that you're presenting. So the things that I don't like about the new project is the scale, sort of the relationships of scales of units. Also, I don't like, it looks like you've lost open space. You've dropped the amount of, it looks like there was landscaping area was at nearly 4,000 square feet in the first round, and it's gone down to a little less than 3,000 in the second round. I don't like that. I would figure that I think we had a good struggle with Mr. Kernal over underground parking and finding ways to get some bona fide landscaping on a project that's around the edges. I think that would be something that I, again, would be hoping for, have seen it. What happened on this project is the studios went up in size 50%. They are larger than Mesa houses now, and I'm concerned about that. the 10 studios went from a 950 square feet average to a 1,300 square foot average. There are many more one-bedroom units that are at 1,500 square feet. Those are not small one-bedroom units. So, and again, I appreciate you're putting together a pro forma. You have the commercial space. This stuff needs to make sense financially to go forward. But at least even in the volume of this building, oh, and then the two-bedroom affordable unit is smaller than one of the market rate studios. The two affordable studios are smaller than one market rate studio. So that's out of proportion. I thought the comments about the historic resources is one that warrants. The historic analysis in the environmental review work dealt with on-site historical resources and not adjacent. And so that does warrant a look. So within the volume that you have, or as I say, its cousin, I think you got so close. You got close on this second round of volume that there may be opportunities to change things around. And again, I really appreciate your comment about process. You've got to stay on some momentum here somehow in order to not be spending all of your resources on red tape. But that there may be some more opportunities for some affordability, a higher number of affordable units within this near volume. Having pointed out these I think oversized, such a large number of oversized studios, and at least edgy one bedrooms. At least the affordable units need to get similar shrift to, or at least a little better shake in the square footage department. So on the environmental documents, I appreciate that the comments about, well, the traffic is not there on this project now. I have bought into the ITE ways of looking at things. I just don't know of a better metric to. I mean, I like seeing a census when something is really a bona fide running operation. Then I like to see a census of what's going on. I feel like this is a little more of a sagging facility here, and I'm not sure we're going to that it would be such a valid comparison. And I think traffic to me is one of the hottest issues that we have to deal with here. I think that the opportunity to do something about the Ralph's delivery question is just, maybe staff could talk about that at some point. It does feel inappropriate that they're it seems to me that's just one of those conditions that just ends up on plans and then doesn't get followed through on.
I think what we need to do is go back and look at the conditions of approval for the Ralph's project, and if they are violating conditions related to deliveries, then we need to talk to Ralph's.
Okay, and perhaps you could go to the folks that Mr. Gray and Ms. Gray, and maybe somehow they can help out in that department of liaisoning with the enforcement staff on that issue. So those are my comments for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. White. Ms. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I felt a little forced to look at Plan B before it had gone to HLC for consideration. So I thought it was a little out of order for us. And with that being the case, I'm going to tell you what I think is really missing. And I noted, as did Commissioner White, the size of these units. And I really think that they're very large. And if they could squeeze down, wouldn't it be nice to have a safe area for children within this site to play? This is a horrible area to release children onto. And so I just think that it's very difficult for people with children to look at this and say, oh, I can't wait to live here. You know, you're going to turn a kid loose with a skateboard and learn to ride a bike at De La Vina and Carrillo, probably one of the toughest spots in the city. So I think the site I think the plan could benefit by something, and a reduction in the footprint of a building would be a great sacrifice to make for children. So I feel strongly about that. The noise issue. I had a friend who lived across from the Arlington Theater, from the back of it. And she would call me sometimes at 6 o'clock on Sunday morning. She'll say, you never believe what's running outside my window. I mean, those trucks are relentless. They idle their engines. Sometimes they use Jake brakes, which I know everybody knows what that sounds like because it startles you sometimes. So there's a huge amount of potential noise impacts here. And if it's an enforcement issue, fine. But if it's not, and it's something people have to live with, we already have had one, I believe it's one application at Garden and Yannonelli to enclose the open space for noise. I can't remember exactly what that was, but that's already been an issue, and that's, you know, we already said yes to that. So people are not comfortable living with consistent urban traffic noise, and that's what you get. I drive that intersection almost daily. Certainly, as we come down and we study those intersections, at Carrillo and the freeway, is that a D or an F? It's really awful. So what we're asking people to live in, we have to carefully consider. Kid area, size of units. I'd just like to see more dirt. Oh, don't want to forget the land use plan. This is what I read so I can sleep at night. West Carrillo Street. Carrillo Street must function as one of the major automobile access points to the Central Business District, CBD, for residents of the Mesa and as well as residents of the South Coast and visitors exiting from the 101 freeway. We all know that because we all drive that. Because it must be capable of handling large amounts of traffic, the existing and future commercial uses bordering Carrillo Street shall be designed to minimize conflict with smooth traffic flow into the CBD. As West Carrillo Street is an entrance to the CBD, it should be developed to serve as an attractive entrance to that area. Just a little bit more. Towards this end, the general plan recommends that the lands along each side of West Carrillo Street from a point mid-block between Chapala and De La Vina Streets westerly towards the 101 freeway be developed with low-intensity commercial uses. New developments should utilize cross streets for access whenever possible rather than taking access off Carrillo Street. This area should be zoned in accordance with the general plan goal to have West Carrillo Street serve as an attractive entrance to the CBD, which is developed with low-intensity uses. So that's the quote from the land use element. So as I evaluate this project in the future, I'll be looking to see how consistent it is with the land use element. And would I support an EIR? Yeah, I would. I would, because I feel strongly that there are pieces of this document produced that just don't quite make it, and I think that someone wanting to put something there should show the impacts of it fully. We need to fully study it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm still trying to, excuse me, I almost lost my composure the way Ms. Larson so adeptly quoted the land use element. I feel completely upstaged. I would offer a couple, just my main concern about this new alternative that's been proposed, like Ms. Larson and Mr. White, have to do with the unit sizes. I think they should come down a little bit more to demonstrate a greater nexus between the units being constructed and the needs of the community. Not the just the affordable needs, but the full range of housing opportunities that could, I think, address what would hopefully attract Santa Barbarans to purchase and utilize these units. That being said, on a bigger picture, I think that these two projects show in real black and white the implications of four-story development versus the 40-foot approach that we're hearing about from a variety of perspectives. To me, it clearly shows some trade-offs, some of which are good and some of which are bad. And it really puts it to the Commission to call the shot and be very clear about where our economic and environmental values sit. I think this new proposal, better than any project I've seen sitting as a planning commissioner, embraces the integration of the EIR process, or the environmental review process, and the planning process. Mr. Yates and his team have taken a bureaucratic, sometimes a maze of bureaucracy, not personal but just structural, and made sense out of it, and come to us with a project that is far more approvable than I think the other project was. But I think what's equally remarkable about this submittal is when I read the applicant's letter to the city and watched the PowerPoint show today, what I came away with was this is the first time an applicant has very skillfully articulated the principles of sound community planning that I've been harping on for better than 2 years now. And I think it provides the city and the Planning Commission with a fantastic opportunity to build on that set of principles, integrate those principles into how we review projects, because now we've got something that really speaks to the planning, call it smart growth, call it sound community planning, call it what you will. These are the types of things, in addition to other social and economic issues, that we're going to have to take into account as we decide how to met out the last increment of growth over the next, I don't know how many years. So I think the applicant needs to be recognized and complimented for taking that step and being so clear. Whether staff completely agrees with how he's interpreted everything is a separate story, but nonetheless, we have the basic moving parts of being able to come back in the negative declaration, which is the document I support in this case, and augment the plans and policies discussion in that ND so that we look at land use compatibility, because clearly compatibility with the properties to the north and to the east and being on Carrillo Street is a critical piece here. But to articulate for us planning commissioners whether or not we can make the findings of a development plan approval that say a project needs to be compatible or consistent with sound community planning principles. And I think we have got a big dose of the meat and potatoes of what goes into that analysis that can bring back to us the reason analysis that we can plant our back foot on and get to a project on this site. And so I think that is extremely valuable. And I look forward to how this dance plays out, because I think it's going in a very, very good direction. And I appreciate everybody who's worked on it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Justice. Ms. Jacobs.
Thank you, Chair Myers. I'd also like to thank the applicant for going much more than the extra mile in this project. I'd also like to thank the HLC for taking a stand in a big and concrete way regarding the urban design guidelines and some of the difficult decisions that have to be made by the HLC on a regular basis. They definitely articulated a strong position on this building, and my compliments to the applicant for taking those to heart and balancing them out and bringing to us what is really a very balanced project. Had the original proposal of 4 stories and 50 feet come to us, I would not have supported it. And I think it would have been the 4th building that I would have said, I can't support this because it doesn't meet the urban design guidelines. So it would have been the number 4 on the list of buildings that are too big and too tall. And but I don't have to say that, because this building is now quite remarkable. Unfortunately, we're losing the 17 affordable units. But again, the balance of the project makes up for it in other ways. The site is underused. It can't stay the way it is because of the soil remediation that is necessary. And regarding the land use element, the project proposes a lower traffic intensity than what is there now. So I think it's important to realize we're not dealing with scraped earth. We're dealing with a project that exists already, and the proposal actually comes in at a lower impact in terms of traffic. And it is asking for no modifications of the kind that we usually see regarding setbacks or parking. So I find that to be very admirable. I think they've done a good job redistributing on site their parking, their buildings, their masses, and really the benefit is to create more space for people. And I just can't say enough how much I appreciate that and how it corresponds to my idea of Santa Barbara, that this is a walkable space. I can see the people enjoying the spaces, sitting in the sunshine, walking, cutting across that corner to get from one part of town to the other. I look forward to seeing how that functions. Regarding the design, I'm happy to let the HLC take that on. The photo simulation from the corner, the before and after, really tells the story in terms of bulk and mass and the changes that have already been made. The one thing I would ask that occur at the HLC level is that once the overall massing is pretty much decided, that those interior paseos and arcades get looked at in some detail. One of the buildings that I see you used as a reference is the La Arcada building. And like that building, you have the storefronts facing onto each other. The commercial spaces have a kind of rapport with the pedestrians walking through. And part of what makes the La Arcada building also work is some art, some fountains, sculpture, frescoes, elements of beautiful detail and charm that I hope this building will be taking to the HLC as well, that those interior paseos are looked at in elevation. And the I want to say one more thing about the rethinking of this and how admirable it is, and it's the kind of thinking that I hope goes into the transit center project. I wish we could kind of take this project and make it the starting point for our transit center. It's even a good site for it. But the flexibility and the thinking and creativity that these designers have put forward in this project is a good model for the city's transit center development. And as Mr. Gilberry said, it was kind of the worst of times and the best of times. This went from a project that I could not support to one that I support very happily. And with the few comments that will come from my colleagues here, in particular, I'd like to see some space for kids. Maybe Paseo Perdido becomes pardon my Spanish, paseo para los niños. We can find some way to find a space for kids on this site. And I would support the negative declaration. I think it's fine with my previous comment about the additional language on neighborhood parks. So thank you again for all your hard work.
Mr. Bartlett?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, this applicant, I think, has done an admirable job of trying to aim at a moving target. I've never seen so many rule shifts and ideological shifts that can actually occur during the time work of, when you start a project to just even getting entitled. So it's good to know that there's an abundance of positive energy and a willingness to try and keep going to get it right. So I commend the applicant on that aspect. As to the two projects that are in this proposal package, I think as an overview, I like the DNA of the 55-unit project. It had small units, it had more affordability, it had a lot of things going for it that I really thought spoke to what I think our community needs. But I think given the current political climate, we also need to look to, where the rules are migrating. But I don't want us to lose sight of all the rules. I think everybody is so focused on building height right now. But as I go to the Housing Policy Steering Committee meetings, there's also a focus on increasing the percentage of affordable housing and ways to do that. So I would like to see the DNA of the 55-unit project with the smaller units and the higher affordability project put together with the imagery and the street elevations and the theming of the 31-unit project. And I think there's a way to do that. You've covered the spectrum. You've got both ends covered, and I think there's something that doesn't give away all of the things that we loved about the bigger project at the expense of the aesthetics and the street appeal. I certainly feel that the central building that is wrapped on all four sides by the perimeter buildings could be at the proposed 50 feet, which is still under 85% of the allowable height, which cannot be seen from any of the public vantage points, to actually maintain a fourth floor in the core and gain back that affordability that we're using. The proposed guidelines on the inclusionary housing are migrating toward a 20% level. So having more units would also, I think, allow us to reach the community's goals on where affordable housing is going, not just building heights. I think we could have the best of both, and I would implore the applicant to explore and take advantage of the best attributes of both of these proposals and meld them together. And I think you've got the parts and pieces, and it wouldn't be a huge stretch, I think, to get there from here, but I think you need to know where everybody's coming from before you feel safe in doing that. I would be willing to support the 50-foot height in the middle, which is, unfortunately, it's off your charts. You're only showing the perimeter buildings along the streets, but you would never see that from any of the sight lines. It's probably most apparent in your 3D modeling images. I'm sure if you had that building in the center core, you wouldn't see it from anywhere, and it would not be impactful to the neighbors. And I think to add back in the affordability component and the smaller units of the original project would help me with the reduction in the stories as it abuts the streets and neighborhoods. I do like the fact on this project that you've broken it up into a multitude of buildings. It's not one structure. The thing I think would be better with the center building being taller, it wouldn't have, I think, the feeling that some of the other more recent projects that have been constructed where the center units are totally surrounded by perimeter buildings, they don't see out. They can see up. But I think it would make actually the center building even nicer without having a street detriment. I think that the reduction in the parking garage, getting more real landscape space and retention area for surface drainage or movements in the right direction. I hope that could come back to us in whichever version moves forward from here and the wider sidewalks. I agree with my colleagues. I think that the paseos are important and there should be attributes for everyone, you know, not just adults but children as well. I think the true landscape component in the paseos is really important, and I think you're committed to that. I'm not worried that that's going to be going away in whichever project you choose to bring forward next time. But I am concerned with the unit sizes. The new project has much larger units. It's the bare minimum on affordability, so I hate to see the project hit any marks on minimalism. I think we should be aspiring higher on the affordability, and I agree with lower on the perimeter elevations. So anyway, I think you've got the kit of parts. It's just a matter of putting them together to, I think, achieve all the goals. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, first, the purpose of today's hearing is to receive comments on the adequacy and completeness of the draft initial study. And we spent all of the time talking about a concept review. So let me first say on the draft initial study and the mitigated negative deck that we've reviewed here, I think that it's adequate with the staff's inputs to the comments made on it. I expect that if the applicant goes forward with a changed proposal, as we've been talking about, that we will have an addendum to the MND that will cover all of the appropriate items, particularly the traffic. Okay, that's the primary purpose. The secondary purpose here, this concept review, we've now seen basically three versions, and I'd say the applicant has really focused the current community discussion on development in the downtown business district to where we have one from column A or one from column B. And I know the applicant has said that he doesn't see that there's room for a middle ground. I just wonder if we aren't forcing the issue to column A or column B without really looking at some middle ground proposals, such as what Mr. Bartlett was just talking about. I'm not going to go any deeper into that, but I do think that there's some potential for middle ground. The alternate proposal, if we're going to get down to my preferences, is the only way to go with some adjustments. The basic proposal with more four-story and so forth, I don't think is the appropriate way to go. Better parking, better opportunity to deal with water, and the commercial unit layout is better streetscape and massing. I do have the same concern that several of my colleagues have mentioned about the fact that the unit sizes, although there are no three-bedroom units, the two-bedroom units and the one-bedroom units are going up in size from the original proposal. I think there's room to take a look at that and see if that's really the best way to go. They're certainly not mega condos, but they are larger. So it's definitely moving in the right direction as far as my position on this is, and I hope when we see it come back after going to the HLC, some of these comments that were made today can be rolled into whatever design we see. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, to start off with, I also support the negative deck approach as well. I think that given what staff has in front of it to augment it will certainly suffice for this project. I appreciate Mr. Bartlett's opening the box of a new iteration that may include some more alternatives, reduction of room sizes, and possibly some more affordable housing. I really, really am sorry to see the former project go from the affordable housing standpoint. I think that this location is prime for this kind of housing, and we need it very much. The city is standing on a fence, and we're looking at building heights on one side and the social and economic issues on the other. And the building heights are getting all the attention right now, and I think it's out of balance. And it's sort of like, we're talking about Santa Barbara's character, and yet we're missing some key points of character. Sort of like Britney Spears going down to Rodeo Drive to buy some new makeup to improve her character. We're not really getting to the essence of some of the things we need to look at in this town. And I think that this project really pointed to improving some of those. The former project really pointed to improving some of the needs of the community. So I'm sorry to see some of those things go away, and I would really like to see a little bit more creativity in getting them back. I really appreciate. I have no objection to a 4-story element in certain parts of the project to accommodate more affordability. Again, I appreciate the notion of bringing down some of the square footage in the other units. I don't know that this is maybe a valid suggestion, but in many other cities we have what I think are called garden apartments, which are semi-subterranean. We have a garage, a 2-story garage thing here with large open spaces that really are private open spaces. If something can be done where true affordability is designed into something that doesn't have stellar views, then I think that's worth considering. So I throw those things out just as concerns and considerations. I think support the comments from the rest of the commission. I think it certainly does point that our land use element needs a new look, and I look for, and I also want to express my own appreciation for coming forward with such a complete and quality alternative with what you've had to face over the last year and a half. So, Ms. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to make a comment about the garden apartment approach. That works well in some areas, but I've lived in garden apartments in traffic areas, and you're really at the level of the tailpipe and the mercy of it as well. So you have to be careful where you plant the garden.
Well, I appreciate that, and perhaps that's what's wrong with me, because I grew up in one.
I spent a lot of time in that.
So, Mr. Yates.
If I may. Thank you, Chair Myers, fellow commissioners. I'd like to just mention a couple of things relative to community input and comments, and perhaps some even comments of the Commission. First on my notes here, the width of the sidewalk on De La Vina. We looked at that very closely in the De La Vina environment with Ralph's loading dock opposite, and took that into account and felt we had a choice to make. Making our plazas and paseos wider and more expansive. Remember, they're now part of the public realm as well, vis-a-vis a wider sidewalk on, because that's really the choice we felt we were making on De La Vina, and we felt that we had a fairly well prioritized order of that. I mean, we will look at it again, but I just wanted you to be aware that's how we deliberated on that. Public comment regarding the removal of contaminated soils. We do have available on public record a hazardous waste and substances report from Kennedy Jenks. It's been approved by the Regional Water Quality Control Board, so that has been approved. They're just simply waiting us to get to a development plan and start, and I know that is public record and available. We also have construction staging traffic plans, truck hauling routes, preliminary foundation reports, geology reports, the cleanup and abatement order itself, and archaeological and arborist reports. We also have a noise acoustic analysis and evaluation report, a waste management plan, and of course the inclusionary housing plan, all on file at the city, which addresses many of the concerns or questions that were asked by the public today. The comments of the Commission. I feel like a full circle at some level when our original challenge was to tackle the issue of the size of the residential units that were being created downtown as a result of variable density ordinances. And you all remember having discussions with me at different times. We have to break that pattern. We have to find a mechanism to be able to create smaller units. And in the Radio Square project, we found that at that time. And we used a method called and I'm going to point a question to staff, called I think Stephen Felstich calls it the below-the-line benefit analysis, which basically enabled us to throw everything in the pot and look at the below-the-line benefit of providing the additional affordable housing. And, of course, the 21 affordable or 38% is way in excess of what the ordinance calls for. I believe, according to Mr. Felstich, that as a matter of policy interpretation, the city will not and cannot do that anymore. And this has significant implications to our response to your suggestions.
What Mr. Yates is referencing is that in order to get the 21 affordable units, they got some bonus density for market units to help support the cost of doing that many affordable units. And as he's stated, that is not the intent of what the affordable housing policies and procedures were going after, is that we needed to keep the density of market rate units no more than the allowed density. So that does limit Mr. Yates or any applicant's ability to do more affordability above the line, if you will. So that is a concern. And there may be, it may be possible to work with the applicant to at least push the number of units up by 1 or 2 without creating a problem. He has increased the commercial square footage in order to help pay for a project with fewer market rate units and meeting the basics of the inclusionary housing ordinance. So it is a pro forma balancing act.
Thank you, Jan, for that. And I think the issue is central. I mean, we weren't being cute with you when we came back with the 31 units. We were responding to that reinterpretation of the ordinance. And we basically have a bottom line, accumulated market rate square footage we need to achieve residentially, and we assigned it to the number of units. And it's no surprise with less units that have come down. And we'd looked at it and looked at this informal threshold we've all been sharing, about 85% of the lot area, and stayed way below that. Mm-hmm. I felt, of course we'd like to be bringing smaller units, but we have the two-level underground parking garage, and that's there by virtue of the brownfields redevelopment. You are not going to see situations in this community come forward where people ordinarily are going to be able to do the types of things you're proposing. There is a minimum threshold here. So we have a unique set of circumstances. Without that below-the-line analysis, it's very difficult for us to see how you would get the feasibility that would allow you to have the plazas and the paseos and the other balanced elements that we're talking about, and make further trade-offs on the level of market rate square footage. So I understand we actually share the goal. We really, really do. And we'll make a good faith effort to come back and respond to that. But I just did want to make you aware of that policy interpretation. Other than that, thank you very much for the comments. I have one other point. If you want to see the interior plazas and paseos, we do have them. In the interest of brevity, we did not show them to you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Hubble, what are you looking for?
Well, there's no action to be taken today.
Yeah, you're
I think
okay.
We've heard your comments and the public's comments on the draft mitigated negative declaration. We'll go back and respond to those comments and make changes where appropriate, and then we will come back with a project.
Okay.
To the Planning Commission.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Yates, and thank you to the public for your comments. Our next item is item number 4.
Mr. Chairman?
It's a discussion item that has been continued to February 21st. Following that is item number 5, which is Regional Housing Needs Allocation Plan. We'll look at